Why did artillery decide battles on the Eastern Front long before infantry ever saw each other? When people think about World War II, they picture tanks colliding, machine guns rattling, soldiers charging through smoke. They imagine violence at eye level, men shooting at men. And yes, that happened. But on the Eastern Front, the deadliest decisions were often made by men who never pulled a trigger and were never seen by the soldiers they killed. They didn't sit behind cannons. They didn't storm trenches. They lay forward of their own lines with binoculars, a map, and a field telephone. And once they spoke, entire sections of the battlefield vanished. By 1943, the Red Army understood something brutal. In 1941, Soviet artillery had been powerful but disorganized. Guns were lost during rapid retreats. Fire missions were delayed. Coordination collapsed under the speed of the German advance. That failure reshaped Soviet doctrine. Artillery would no longer merely support infantry. It would prepare the battlefield. It would suppress it. It would break it. And to do that, someone had to see for the guns. Forward observers were pushed dangerously close to the front, often less than 500 meters from German lines, sometimes closer. Their task was simple on paper: identify targets, transmit coordinates, adjust fire. In reality, it meant lying exposed in shell-torn ground, trying to distinguish friend from foe through smoke, snow, or summer heat shimmer. The guns themselves could be positioned 5, 10, sometimes 15 kilometers behind the lines. Soviet 76mm divisional guns, 122mm howitzers, 152mm heavy pieces capable of collapsing buildings with a single impact. The gunners never saw what they destroyed. They relied entirely on the voice on the line. A typical fire mission began with a single ranging shot. One shell fired to test distance. The observer would watch the impact, short or long, and adjust. Add 100. Left 50. Each correction shifted the fall of steel across the map. Once satisfied, the observer would order fire for effect. Multiple guns would answer at once. Seconds later, trenches would collapse. Tree lines would erupt into splinters. Men who had been crouched behind cover would disappear beneath shock waves and shrapnel. On the German side, the system functioned similarly. Wehrmacht artillery observers operated with 105mm LEFH-18 and heavier 150mm SFH-18 batteries. German doctrine emphasized rapid, concentrated fire on identified enemy strongpoints. The side that located enemy positions first could silence them before direct combat even began. And on the Eastern Front, that often determined survival. During the siege battles around Leningrad, Soviet observers positioned in ruined buildings directed artillery against German trench networks that were sometimes only a few hundred meters away. In winter, snow concealed movement, but also distorted depth perception. A misjudgment of 50 meters could mean the difference between suppressing a machine gun nest and striking one's own rifle company. Friendly fire was not rare. It was an inherent risk of indirect fire in fluid conditions. In forest fighting near Muga in early 1943, Soviet reports describe artillery adjustments made under poor visibility, where German infiltration had blurred the line between positions. Initial salvos landed dangerously close to Soviet troops. Corrections followed quickly, but not before casualties were reported among the very infantry the artillery was meant to protect. The guns had done exactly what they were told to do. The map had been wrong, the observer had misjudged, and once the shells were in the air, there was no recalling them. The escalation of artillery dominance became undeniable at Kursk in July 1943. Before the German offensive began, the Red Army constructed layered defensive belts reinforced by anti-tank guns and pre-registered artillery zones. Soviet observers had already plotted likely German approach routes. When panzer divisions began their advance, they entered areas already calculated for concentrated fire. German forces responded with their own artillery preparation, attempting to suppress Soviet batteries and defensive nodes before armored thrusts moved forward. For days, thousands of guns exchanged fire. Much of that exchange occurred beyond direct line of sight. Men advancing across open fields were struck by shells fired by guns they would never see. Counter-battery fire targeted enemy artillery based on sound ranging, flash spotting, and observer reports. The battlefield became a grid of coordinates. Control no longer depended on who could see farther. It depended on who could calculate faster. By 1944, the Red Army had elevated artillery coordination to a level unmatched earlier in the war. Operation Bagration demonstrated this transformation with brutal clarity. Soviet observers identified German defensive sectors, supply routes, and reserve assembly areas. Artillery was massed in extraordinary concentrations, in some sectors exceeding 200 guns per kilometer of front. When the offensive began in June 1944, the preparatory barrage did not merely soften defenses, it erased them. German trenches collapsed under sustained fire, communication lines were severed, command posts were buried, entire units were disrupted before they could respond. Yet even in these overwhelming barrages, everything still depended on individuals positioned forward. Observers had to confirm target areas, adjust rolling barrages to match infantry advance, shift fire as resistance pockets emerged. If the barrage moved too quickly, infantry advanced without cover. If it moved too slowly, shells fell among friendly troops. In urban fighting, the margin for error narrowed further. During the Battle of Königsberg in 1945, Soviet observers operating inside shattered buildings directed heavy artillery against fortified German positions across streets sometimes less than 100 meters wide. Visibility after each salvo vanished in dust and debris. Structures partially collapsed, altering reference points. Observers had to rely on map grids superimposed on landscapes that no longer resembled their pre-war layouts. In several documented instances, continued fire was requested on positions believed to be enemy strongpoints, only for assault troops to discover that friendly soldiers had taken temporary shelter inside damaged structures. Indirect fire had obeyed orders precisely. Reality had shifted faster than the map. German forces experienced similar consequences during defensive withdrawals in 1944 and 1945. As front lines became unstable and units intermingled, artillery observers struggled to maintain accurate targeting. Under pressure, adjustments were sometimes made based on incomplete information. The speed of Soviet advances meant that coordinates plotted hours earlier could become dangerously outdated. Artillery was powerful. It was not forgiving. Strategically, artillery became the backbone of operational planning on the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union produced enormous quantities of guns and shells, prioritizing artillery as a means to compensate for earlier operational disasters. German forces, increasingly constrained by manpower shortages, relied on artillery to stabilize sectors where infantry strength was insufficient. But regardless of scale, the system remained fundamentally fragile. It required communication lines that could be severed by a single shell. It required observers who could remain calm under fire while adjusting coordinates. It required trust between a man with binoculars and a battery commander miles away. The psychological burden was rarely discussed openly. Forward observers knew that each correction shifted lethal force across terrain occupied by human beings, enemy, and sometimes their own. They did not witness the immediate human consequences directly. They saw impacts, they saw earthrise, they saw movement stop. The rest was inferred. Artillery controlled the battlefield without being seen because it transformed distance into advantage. Guns did not need line of sight. They needed information. And on the Eastern Front, information often came from men lying dangerously close to the enemy, measuring terrain through smoke and snow, making decisions that would detonate seconds later. Infantrymen often feared artillery more than small arms fire. Machine guns could be identified, snipers could be hunted. Artillery arrived without warning. It struck from beyond the horizon, and the men responsible for its accuracy were rarely known by name. They were not the ones in photographs. They were not the ones in propaganda footage. But in many battles from Leningrad to Kursk to Königsberg, they determined when an attack stalled, when a defense collapsed, and when an entire section of front ceased to exist. All it took was a map, a coordinate, and a voice on a telephone. And once that voice gave the order, the shells were already on their way.